Hello, thank you for joining us today and welcome to the latest installment of the Living Leadership webinar series brought to you with support from Sylvan Laureate Foundation and the American Express Foundation. Today's webinar is titled Learning to Lead, the YouthActionNet Approach. My name is Eric Lin and I'll be your facilitator today. I'm a program manager here at the International Youth Foundation, and I'd like to welcome our presenter today, my colleague Joel Adriance, who's also a program manager here at IYF. We're both working on the YouthActionNet program. So I would just like to bring in Joel and thank him for coming by.
Thank you, Eric. Really appreciate it. And it's really fun to have the chance to talk about a topic I'm really passionate about, which is leadership development and learning. And so we'll just jump right in. And I'd like to invite all of you who are listening in today to just take a moment to kind of do a brief visualization. And what I'd like you to do is reflect on a moment from your own life of deep learning or growth. This could be in relation to your leadership development. It could just be a moment in your life in which you were really challenged to acquire a new skill set, to think differently about your own capacities, to take on a new challenge. And what I'd like you to think about is what exactly was happening in that moment. Where were you? How did you feel? And as you think about this moment, specifically, what factors made growth and learning possible? What factors made it easier for you to sustain the change that you were going through, whether at the level of the skill set, a capacity, or perhaps at a deeper level of identity and growth. And I think what we all realize when we do this type of reflection is that learning is really a part of our everyday life. It's something we're intimately familiar with. And yet we rarely think about the how or why of how or why some learning experiences are successful and others are quite difficult for us. And so our goal for today is to specifically reflect on what it takes to sustainably learn and grow. And we're going to try to kind of pull back the curtain and take a look backstage to identify key factors, strategies we can use to grow our leadership and to support the leadership development of others. And so our agenda for the presentation part of the webinar is that first I'm going to share a little bit of context about the YouthActionNet approach, which is how do we think about leadership, what is leadership, and how it's developed, and what does that look like at a very specific level within our fellowship programs. Coming out of that example and that context, I'm going to go through some principles for leadership learning and growth in terms of how do adults, young adults, youth learn and grow, and how does that connect with this idea of leadership. And then the final section, strategies for leadership development, I'm going to take some of these principles and talk about 5 specific ways we can put them into action in our own lives, but also when we're supporting the leadership development of others. And as I share this material, I'd like to give a specific shout out to a friend and colleague, Jim Toole of the Compass Institute and University of Minnesota, who's worked with us at YouthActionNet for many years and really influenced a lot of our thinking about leadership development and also about how young social entrepreneurs learn. So thank you, Jim. And some of the material you'll see today is actually adapted from him. So let's jump in. Starting with context. So YouthActionNet is really a network of local, regional, and global fellowship programs, all of which support the scale and sustainability of social ventures and the leadership development of young social entrepreneurs. Each of these programs is run in a local context, adapted to local reality, and the exact structure is a little bit different. It's diverse. It's contextualized. At the same time, our core activity and our core approach is really shared across our network, which is over 18 fellowship programs around the globe. And really our goal that unites all of these programs is, when we think about the leadership development of young social entrepreneurs, is to develop innovative, entrepreneurial, and high-impact leadership that drives social change. And so when we think about what leadership development really is, we have a few core assumptions that I'll explain. And so the first assumption is that leadership is a choice, that leaders take the initiative, and that they don't necessarily need a formal position to do that. Second, leadership is an everyday act, and so leadership is not just about being in charge. It's not just about making the big decisions or the big calls. It's about small acts of courage in our everyday life, small acts that make a difference to yourself and to others. Finally, leaders are made, and so our belief is that while people have very different levels of capacity and talents, everyone has the ability to exercise leadership in their daily life and in their context, whatever that might be, and that leadership is something that can be practiced and can be learned. When we think about the competencies that make up leadership, one of the bodies of research or the ways of thinking about competencies that's influenced us is that of Zenger and Folkman. And they wrote a book called The Extraordinary Leader that was based on research in which they did over 200,000 evaluations of 20,000 leaders around the globe. And what they were trying to discover was what are the behaviors or competencies that separate the top 10% of leaders from the bottom 10%. So that the competencies that would help them to predict who are the extraordinary leaders versus which are the ones that are the least effective. And what they found was that there were 16 key competencies that they saw again and again in this body of study of these 20,000 leaders. And they took these 16 competencies and they grouped them into 5 categories, which is what you see on the screen. And to walk you really quickly through this in terms of, this is a way of thinking about what is leadership and how does it work. The first set of competencies is results focused. And here they identified things like drive, the ability to set goals, to take initiative. Second, leading change. And so this includes championing change processes, taking strategic perspectives, connecting your group to the outside world. Character particularly involves integrity and honesty that leaders display in their interactions with others. Interpersonal skill sets included competencies like the ability to powerfully communicate, the ability to inspire and motivate others to high performance, the capacity to build relationships with others and to develop others, and finally what they call capability. And this is really about technical skill sets, problem solving, the ability to innovate within the context of your work. At a very concrete level, what does this look like? All of our fellowship programs, whether in Chile, Australia, our regional program in Francophone Africa, our national program in Spain, they have a mix of in-person intensive training and then in a period of virtual support. And when we say virtual support, those are things like coaching, ongoing opportunities for self-development, opportunities to position their social ventures, to gain access to resources, to take in some cases virtual courses or webinars. And the exact design is different, but they all share these kind of core characteristics. A period of intensive in-person training, a period of virtual support. And I think personally that there are kind of 3 things that really set our programs apart from other similar programs around the world. And if you're curious to read more about these 3 particular characteristics, I wrote a blog that's at the YouthActionNet blog that you can read about. And so the first characteristic is that our programs are really human-centered. And so what I mean by that is that we put relationships at the center of our training programs and the center of our support. And the idea is that we want to create a space in which our fellows can authentically interact with each other, can show care for each other, and can fully be themselves. And that includes the ability to be vulnerable, to talk about failures. This aspect of human-centered also means that we recognize that people learn not just in classrooms, but also outside the classroom, whether that's in a discussion over coffee, in play, in nature. Secondly, we try to create a space in which our fellows can really think big. And so this means the ability to kind of gain perspective on their own leadership journeys, on the work they do, to think about who they are and how their venture is working. and to also think about where they want to go and how they're going to go there. And so we do a lot of work with goal setting and also with coaching processes that help people to take their goals, take their observations into the real world. Third, our programs are learner-driven. And I'm going to talk a lot about this particular concept in the next section. But the idea is that each fellow is ultimately responsible for their own learning, and that our staff is there to accompany, to empower, and to connect, but that they are in the leadership seat in terms of their learning process. So let's, now that we understand a little bit about the context in terms of how YouthActionNet approaches leadership development and what leadership means to us, let's go a little bit into kind of the wider principles in terms of how people develop their leadership, how people grow and learn. And I think that one of the interesting things about learning in an adult context or a young adult context is that it really is quite different from the type of learning that we experience in childhood and adolescence. And we often assume we understand how we learn because we spent 20+ years of our life in a classroom. But the reality is that that type of classroom learning is very, very different from the type of learning that most of us experience as adults. And probably the number one difference is that as adults, there is no clear teacher or authority in charge of our learning and growth process. We are each ultimately responsible for that growth and development. And this is not to say that there are no guides, but that who is teaching us something is a role that can shift and is very flexible and is constantly changing. And we don't have that sense of hierarchy, and we are ultimately responsible. And when I say responsible, that means that we have to define what we need, how we can best receive it, and we are responsible for seeking out the right opportunities to acquire that knowledge or that opportunity. And of course, this is not just true for ourselves. Learning to support the growth and development of others is also a critical leadership skill, and many would argue is actually at the core of what it means to be a leader. Another way in which it's different to learn as an adult is that in adulthood, a minority of learning occurs in classrooms, trainings, or formal courses. And so where most learning is occurring is in experience. It's in the workplace, in personal life, in moments of individual exploration, reading, discovery, in moments of introspection or reflection, and also in conversations with peers, with mentors, with others who are around us. And unfortunately, we often undervalue this type of experiential learning that is actually really powerful. And because of that, we fail to create the appropriate structures or practices that would make this type of learning more effective. And so in order for the experiential learning that is the dominant way we learn as adults to be sustainable, we have to be deliberate. And be deliberate about seeking out the right opportunities and conditions and relationships to learn, whether peers, mentors, friends. We also have to create regular moments to process learning and to reflect, because reflection is really critical to make connections, to understand lived experiences, and to test and question our assumptions. This is not to say that formal learning processes are no longer valid as youth, as young adults, as adults. They can still play a really important role in our learning and growth process. And again, formal learning refers to courses, training, even degree programs, university, a master's program, a diploma. That being said, in order for formal learning processes to really be effective as adults, as young adults, these processes have to help us to value and shape the ongoing informal learning that occurs through experiences, relationships, and personal reflection, and to put this learning in the light of new concepts, frameworks, and skill sets. So there has to be a dialogue between the formal and informal learning spaces in order for the formal learning processes to really mean something. Regardless of where we learn, in formal or informal spaces, it's really important to understand that there are less effective and more effective ways of learning. And so what you see on the screen is a pyramid that explains the average rate of retention, or how much people still remember and can use a new type of knowledge 24 hours after learning, so one day later. And what you can see is that the more active and the greater the level of responsibility given to the learner in the education process, the greater the rate of retention. And by far, the most effective way to learn something is to teach others. And just a little bit beneath that, to practice by doing. Now, when we think about leadership learning specifically, or leadership growth, obviously we're not just talking about acquiring a new concept or a new skill. We're also really thinking about changing behaviors, enhancing our capabilities, and in some spaces, actually even changing the way we think about the world, our beliefs, the way we think about ourselves, our identity. And so this is really goes from the more superficial level all the way to a very, very deep level. And when we think about how we want to grow as leaders and how we can best support the leadership growth of those around us, it's really critically important to know what are we asking of ourselves or of others in a given situation. Because it's one thing to ask someone to better understand their environment, to gain informational skill sets, and it's another to challenge them or to challenge ourselves to change at that much deeper level. And so we have to be realistic and fair in terms of the time, the effort, and the depth that's required in a given moment. And there's also key implications in terms of the type of support that we might need for that growth or change to be successful. And one way to think about this is to understand the distinction between what's called technical learning and adaptive learning. And so technical learning is learning that's informational in nature. So acquiring new knowledge, new skills. This is a short-term process. It's not to say that it's not complex. We can learn very complex things that are informational, but it's something that happens in the short term. And it's rarely threatening in nature, and because of that, it's a lower threshold of support. Adaptive learning is learning that is transformational. And so this implies changes in habits, behaviors, roles, norms, even worldviews. Because of it's at a very different level of depth, it's longer term. And it can actually be threatening to our existing sense of self, the way we think about the world. And because of that, it really requires a higher threshold of support. And so just to give you a very concrete example of what this looks like, if we imagine that you are a young social entrepreneur, that you're leading a venture, an initiative with a co-founder, and that your space is the technical side of managing programs. And so if you didn't really understand how to monitor and evaluate programs, you could take a course, you could talk to an expert, you could learn about how to write an indicator or how to design a metric. That would be an example of technical learning because it's gaining a new information, a new skill set. But this skill set doesn't require you to change the way you think about yourself or the world. It doesn't require a new set of behaviors. It's within your comfort zone. It's something that in this program space that is your space where you feel comfortable, where you have a high sense of capability. But if we imagine now that you're a co-founder who has been managing the business development side of things, who's been out talking to investors or funders, who's been making pitches, public presentations, for different life circumstances, your co-founder drops out. And you're left managing both the program side and the business development side of your venture. And so all of a sudden, perhaps as someone who feels very uncomfortable meeting new people or speaking in public, you have to make pitches, meet with donors, introduce yourself in a room of a cocktail where you have to network. And maybe this is something that's incredibly uncomfortable for you because you think of yourself as someone who's introverted, you think of yourself as someone who's not good at public speaking, perhaps you have a lot of fears. And so this would be an adaptive learning. This would be transformational because all of a sudden you're taking on a role and you're changing the way you think about yourself. You're learning new behaviors and habits that really go beyond your comfort zone and go beyond what you have traditionally felt you're good at doing and where you feel your best at working. And so if we think about this adaptive or transformational learning, again, what this really requires us is to move outside of our comfort zones and into the realm of the unknown, to question, test, and explore. And this can be extremely challenging and even threatening as we begin to question our core assumptions and beliefs. And so sometimes we take a step outside of our comfort zone, we get scared, that we feel like the level of challenge is too much, and we shut down. And so one of the things that's really important for us to think about in our own development, but also as we support others, is to help individuals negotiate processes of change by finding the balance between appropriate challenge and adequate support. And so appropriate challenge, if we think about the two extremes, there's a level of challenge that is so low that we never step outside of our comfort zone. And because of that, we don't grow, we don't develop. But there's also a level of challenge that is so high that it's so beyond what we're able to do or to provide in a given moment that we shut down, that we pull back, that we have a sense of failure that is really, really hard to come back from. So we have to find that appropriate level of challenge somewhere in the middle. On the other hand, we also have to have the right level of support. And so when we have not enough support, again, we can start to shut down, we can pull back, we can question ourselves. But when we have too much support, again, we don't grow because that support can be stifling, and a part of ourselves that we maybe need to develop, that we need to work on, we just never do because we become overly reliant on that support. So that kind of brings to a close the conceptual part of what I wanted to discuss, a few set of ideas about how adults, young adults, youth learn and grow, and how specifically we can grow our leadership and what that implies. And so now I'm going to kind of take the concepts we just ran through and put this into 5 specific strategies that you can put into practice in your own life, but also as you work with others whose leadership you want to support. And so the first strategy is to take responsibility for your own learning and growth. And in the context of supporting others, to empower others to do the same and to know your limits. And so this goes back to our principle of, as adults, we're ultimately responsible for our own learning processes. There's no one else who will seize the opportunity for us, who can tell us exactly what we need or what's the best resource. We're in the driver's seat. We can ask for support, we can ask for guidance, but it's something that we have to actively take on. We have to be deliberate, and we have to have clear that this is our responsibility. The second strategy that I think is really, really important is this idea of learning relationships. And so we talked earlier about, that if a lot of the learning that goes on in adult life is in the realm of experience, one of the most powerful things we can do is to seek out people that help us to learn, help us to grow, help us to evolve. And so these are peers, these can be mentors, these can even be people that we don't think of maybe as friends, but that really challenge our thinking. People that make us question our assumptions. People who can provide us with information and a different way of thinking about things that really challenges us and that helps us to process the learning that's going on in our real life in the light of new ways of thinking. The third strategy is to make reflection routine. And this sounds very basic, but it's actually something that's incredibly powerful. And again, with this idea of that a majority of our learning, a majority of our growth occurs through experience, one of the ways we can make that more powerful, more effective, and more sustainable is to create regular spaces for reflection. And this can involve practices like meditation, journaling, but it doesn't have to be that formal. It can also be something like having a regular point in your week or your day where you go out for a run or you go for a walk and you just let your mind go over the things that have been happening. Because until we take those experiences and start to process, start to make connections, start to question the how and why of why things are happening the way they are, of why things are working the way they are, of what else might I need to do or what else could I have done. We don't take that next step in terms of really anchoring our learning and making it usable for other occasions. So make reflection routine. The fourth strategy is to practice active learning. If we remember that pyramid, when we consume new information, when we're trying to learn a new skill, when we're trying to enhance a behavior, that the more active we are in our process and the more responsibility that's put on us as learners, the more effective our learning is. And so if you remember, the two most effective ways to learn something new is to practice by doing and to teach others. And so an incredibly powerful way to challenge yourself when you're trying to learn something new is to really to put into practice, but then also to sit down with others who want to learn this as well and try to explain it, try to teach it, try to give them guidance. Our fifth strategy and final strategy is to constantly test the limits of your comfort zone. And so this idea that we simply don't grow if we always keep ourselves within the realm of what's comfortable, of what we're good at, of where we feel like we're less likely to fail. And so we have to kind of keep testing the waters, moving outside, saying, I feel like I'm not good at doing this, or I know that going to this networking meeting or taking on this role is something that's going to be really challenging, that I have fears. But I'm going to do it because I know it's the only way I'm going to keep growing. And this is a part of myself that I can develop and I can enhance my capacity. And as we do this, we have to remember this concept of adequate challenge and appropriate support. That if the challenge is too great, we often shut down. If the challenge is not enough, we simply don't grow. If the support is too great, we become stifled and we don't develop. If the support is not enough, we often shut down. And so this is often a dialogue with the people that are around you, and particularly mentors, supervisors, people you consider a guide, where you can ask for the right support, or you can say, I need to do this a little bit more on my own. I need a little bit more space to breathe. So these are the 5 strategies that I think are really important and to think about when we want to challenge our learning growth as leaders. And so to close, I'd like to invite you to return to the visualization that we started this presentation with, which was to identify a moment of deep learning or growth in your own life. And as you think about this moment once again, I want you to think about these 5 strategies you just heard. Whether it's creating space for reflection, stepping outside your comfort zones, forming learning relationships, any of these 5 strategies. And I want you to think, how could you have applied this one strategy in that scenario? And if you had applied it, how might that have changed the results, for better or for worse? And how might it actually have changed your understanding of the experience in and of itself? And the challenge with these things is that they really aren't that complex. They're not that hard to understand, but they're hard to put in practice. And so I would invite you to think about these 5 strategies, to think about these concepts, and to try to practice them in small ways in your life this week, because these are things that really require some deliberate action and some deliberate thinking. And so that brings to a close our presentation, and I'll hand things back to Eric for this next section of our webinar.
Thanks, Joel. It was a very good presentation. Just to the audience listening, remember to type in your questions, if you have any, in that question box in the dashboard. Just to get us started, I had a question myself. The kind of approach that we're talking about here is rooted in some assumptions that you had kind of gone over regarding how leadership is a choice, it's in action, it's kind of a decision that you make. And I just wanted to see if there's any sort of observations about or examples about what this might look like for someone as they're going through to develop leadership or to learn leadership?
Sure. So, you know, I think that the way we think about leadership in YouthActionNet is that it's this concept of everyday actions, that leadership is an exercise. It's something you do. And because it's something you do, it doesn't require a formal position, and it can be done by anyone. It's not something that you have to be born with incredible talents and gifts. This is a part of all of us that we can choose to develop. And so to be very concrete, if we think about a mother with a family, maybe a single mother, I think that there's incredible leadership opportunities and leadership actions that a mother takes every day to try to provide the best situation for her family, to help her children to grow and to learn. If we think about that, could be something as small as standing up for your child when they're being picked on by others. It could be something a little bit bigger. It could be something like a young mother choosing to move her family from the town where she grew up to a bigger city where there's better educational opportunities for her kids. And knowing that it's going to require a lot of sacrifice, but saying, I have to do this for them. And so there's an act of courage there, an act of vision, an act of integrity that is incredibly important. And we might not think of that as leadership because no one named her president, she's not a CEO, but she's doing something that makes a difference in her life and the life of her children that is not easy to do and that requires a real sense of drive and of values and of integrity.
So there's this kind of talks about one of the strategies for leadership development as well. When you talk about taking responsibility for your own learning and growth, there's a certain element of motivation underlying a lot of this. And I was just wondering if you have any insight on how to either find that motivation or how to cultivate it in others if you're thinking about maybe a leader trying to cultivate that motivation to learn and develop among their team.
Sure. I think it's hard. There's, obviously we balance on the one hand, all of us, in a set of passions, things that drive us, that naturally motivate us, that we find exciting. And on the other hand, we have kind of a sense of inertia of, it's easy to remain in your comfort zone. It's easy to avoid hard work. It's easy to not take responsibility for your own learning and growth. And so there's this kind of play between this kind of larger sense of who we'd like to be and this excitement that comes through taking on new challenges and through exploring our passions, and then a sense of inertia that maybe drags on that. And I think that one of the things that helps people in this process is that it is exciting when we feel like we are really learning new things or developing a part of ourselves in a way that's successful. And so if you go back to this idea of adequate support and appropriate challenge, when someone really finds that balance, it can be a very exciting moment because you start to have small successes in which things that maybe you didn't think were possible or in a part, something you always kind of wanted to do but never had the chance to develop in yourself, and you start to do it and you start to become better at it, and there's an inherent reward to that I think is very motivating. To give a concrete example, if you are terrified of public speaking, this is something that if you start to take small steps to try to work on your capability, you try to do practice, you start to do presentations and first in front of maybe just you in the mirror, then maybe with some people that you really trust and you know they're not going to attack you if you do it wrong. And slowly you start to practice, you start to gain a sense of competency. All of a sudden you realize that something that used to give you a lot of fear is no longer quite as fear-provoking. And that's incredibly rewarding and it's interesting and it's exciting. And so as leaders, when we help people to explore things and to find those small successes, to find that appropriate balance between challenge and support, but also to connect with their passion points. All of that helps us, I think, to really take that responsibility that's ultimately required for us to continue to grow and develop.
So this kind of leads into an audience question. You were talking about comfort zones and that balance and what happens when you're on the appropriate side of it. But what happens when you go out of your comfort zone or you push yourself too much beyond the limit, and what would possible scenarios be resulting from that?
Sure. I'll tell you a story from my own life. So when I was just starting as a kind of a young professional and I was working with a nonprofit organization, the leader of that organization saw some potential in me and asked me to lead a particular project after a period where I was working with them to take on the leadership of a project where I was supposed to coordinate a team of 5 people and kind of oversee the development of a very complex program, including budget and other things over about a year period. And the initial idea was that I was going to be kind of mentored, that we'd kind of co-lead between me and this other person, and because I was very new, I'd never done something like this before. And for different things, different reasons, this person was not able to really provide a lot of support. They were actually very removed from the process. And in the course of the program, we dealt with some very challenging issues, both externally in terms of how the program was being implemented, and internally in terms of how the team was working. Because I was in my early 20s, there was another person on the team who was in his 40s, who I was technically supervising, and there was some tensions there, and I didn't know how to deal with it. And it became so challenging and so stressful to me that I actually asked to resign from that position, because I totally shut down. I was just, I didn't know what to do. I felt incredibly frustrated. I felt like a failure. I felt like I'd let down the trust that had been placed in me. I wanted to go back to a position of lower responsibility. And so that was an example in which what exactly happened there. One, I totally stepped outside my comfort zone. That's positive in and of itself. I went from a role in which I was at a lower level of responsibility to one in which I had incredibly high responsibility and in which I had to do a whole series of things I'd never done before. Supervise individuals, lead budgets, resolve complex technical issues in the program implementation. And I didn't really have the right support. I think that if I had, as with the initial idea, someone who was really mentoring me and was helping me in some key moments to understand how I could have approached some of these problems, I think I probably would have stuck with it. But I ended up shutting down. I ended up pulling back. I kept with the project to the end, but we ended up having to kind of rework some of the roles. And there was a tremendous sense of failure and frustration from that. And I think what was good was that the sense of failure was not so profound that I wasn't willing to give it another try later on. But I needed some distance, and I needed to kind of let that sense of failure sink in. And I think also wrap my mind around the fact that I think a lot of us are brought up with this idea that failure is just an awful thing. It's not something that happens when you're really good, when you're really confident. And that if you do fail, that maybe it says something about who you are at a deeper level. And I had to wrestle with that because, those were the kind of thoughts I was having. And what I realized in that process, and it was actually a really constructive process for me, was that it wasn't the deep, dark place I thought it was. And I was willing to try it again. But it required also some guidance, some mentoring, some distance, some reflection to reach that point.
Great, thank you. Another question from the audience is, how do you develop a collective leadership among a group of young adults?
Sure. I think this is it's a very complex undertaking, and I think that there are a lot of aspects to this. But if we return back to the kind of concepts and principles we've been exploring today, I think a lot of them are valid in this in a context where we want to develop the collective leadership of a group. And so, on the one hand, encouraging a sense of responsibility. And so this idea that we are each responsible for the larger outcomes of what's happening, and that we're each responsible for doing our part in the best way possible and for seeking out the help that we need, the opportunities we need, the resources we need to do it well. And so cultivating that sense of responsibility is definitely a core part of that process. Another part is really, when you're working with a group, is that communication is so critical. And so creating spaces for group reflection, for example, not just individual reflection, can also be very powerful. And so in a group situation in which communication is poor, collective leadership quickly breaks down. But if there are regular spaces in which not only can we connect and discuss and exchange information, but there's actually a context of trust, of strong interpersonal relationships that are established, of a shared sense of mission, it's easier to work through the challenges that are inevitably faced in that process. And so cultivating that larger sense of mission, of trust, building those learning relationships, but then having those moments of reflection. That could be something as simple as, you have a crazy week, everyone is off, running around doing a million things. There's a lot of perhaps independence in that kind of a context where there's a sense of collective leadership. But make sure that, Monday morning or Monday afternoon or whatever it might be, that there's a standing medium where everyone gets together, where you talk through work plans, where you talk through challenges. And don't let it just be a formal meeting. With the YouthActionNet team, a lot of our best moments and moments that really reinforce the interpersonal trust and relationships and the learning relationships that exist in our team come from when we get outside of the office. And so we go to a bar, we go to someone's house, we travel together to some of the programs. Those are moments that really build a lot of trust, and they build the interpersonal relationships required for collective leadership to really occur.
Thank you. I think there's also kind of a difference here between collective leadership and collaborative leadership, right?
Sure.
Where maybe there is someone who's leading a process or a project in close collaboration with other team members, rather than having kind of a diffusion of responsibility among several people, which could kind of create a situation where nobody's really taking ownership of it.
Yeah, yeah. I definitely believe in the power of roles, clear roles, and then not every decision needs to be taken by every person. Sometimes it's much more efficient, and it just works better to have roles in which there's a clear sense of trust, good communication, but what I have the power to decide is not the same as what someone else has the power to decide. And personally, I'm comfortable with that. But I think it really depends on the group identity. It depends on the context of what you're working on, the venture, initiative, program, company, whatever it is that is the collective part. You have to find a structure that works in that context.
Yeah. So kind of going back to the previous question about comfort zones and pushing yourself, one of our audience members is asking, what recommendations do you have to invoke a sense of accountability in others without becoming overly invested and becoming the support, the kind of the stifling support that could stall their growth?
Yeah. It's really hard. It's really, really hard. I think that, for example, if you think about a parent as a type of leader, I think a lot of parents struggle with this with their kids. I think that a lot of supervisors struggle with this with their supervisees, and it's something that's very complex. And I think one of the things you can do to make it work better is to constantly question yourself. And I don't mean question yourself in terms of doubts. I mean question yourself in terms of making sure that you're regularly asking yourself, is this working? Is it the right level? And the level of support that's required and the level of challenge that's required in a given situation is actually very dynamic. It's constantly shifting. And as someone gains new skills, new capacities, new responsibilities, the amount of support should be lowered, the amount of challenge should be raised, right? But it's not something you can do unilaterally. You have to also have that dialogue with the person. And something as simple as sitting down with someone you're working with and saying, am I doing this right? Are you getting the support you need to do your job well? Is there anything else I could be doing? Are you being challenged? Do you feel like you're growing? Do you have the opportunity to develop new skills and capacities in the work that you're currently doing? Having those conversations is so important. I think one of the things that happened in the story I told earlier in my own life and development, no one ever asked me that. No one ever said, do you need support? Is everything okay? is the challenge the right level? Because, and I didn't. And what's interesting is I didn't know what to ask. I didn't. I think if a similar situation had happened now, I would know to say, okay, I need to if they're not going to ask me, I need to tell them I need support. And so there's a part of this that grows over time in terms of having the awareness of when to ask for support. But there's a lot of people that struggle with that they're not good at that. They feel maybe like it's a bad thing to say, I'm overwhelmed. So one, we have to build that trust environment that we talked about earlier, where people feel that they can say, I'm not doing well, or actually, I need you to step back a little bit and give me some space to breathe, because I'm ready for a new challenge. I'm ready for more responsibility. I could do this on my own. So those are just a few thoughts about that question.
Thank you. To kind of change tact a little bit, there's a question from an audience member about different contexts. So what difference do you feel there is in learning and leading in developed nations or developing nation contexts? Or is there one?
That's a really interesting question. Our program, YouthActionNet, is across a range of countries of all types, all different levels of development. And our global program, we have youth apply from all around the world. I think we've had over 80 countries participate in the Global Fellowship. So we've really seen this in a lot of contexts. And I would say that there are definitely differences at a local level in terms of what this looks like, how it plays out, the specific set of challenges that are being faced. But as a whole, obviously, there's more in common than there is different. For example, when we look at young social entrepreneurs around the globe and the type of challenges that they're consistently facing in their own leadership development, also externally in terms of the types of challenges they're facing as they lead their ventures, it's really a lot of the same things over and over again. On the leadership side, for example, I think a lot of people struggle with issues of time management, energy management, the ability to separate themselves from their venture, to know when to find space for themselves and their own learning and development needs versus when it's the moment to give 150% to their current work. Another leadership challenge that I think is very common is that people struggle with relationships. The interpersonal part, the human resources management part is very challenging. How do you motivate a team? How do you resolve conflicts, strong personalities, differing opinions? It's something that particularly young leaders really have to learn, and they have to learn it through experience. At a level of infrastructure, for example, between the developing world and the so-called developed world, there are differences in terms of, for example, what are the educational opportunities that the average person has had, or to what degree are they plugged into maybe global information streams and processes. But that's changing as well, because I think with the internet and with the globally connected world we live in, those differences are disappearing in a lot of contexts.
Thank you. We have another question. I think it's a very important question. Unfortunately, the asker has gone offline, but I'm going to just ask anyway. Sophie was asking, I'm a leader and I love delegating tasks, yet I find myself doing all the delegated tasks before because I can't get my subordinates to do things as fast as I want. Please advise.
Yeah. It's a great question because this is another example of just one of those classic challenges that young leaders face, leaders of all types face actually, all ages, without, in any context around the world. So when you think about delegation and why delegation is challenging, I think there's at least two parts of the question, right? One has to do with the subordinates themselves. And there can be a capacity issue in terms of their ability to execute a task we've asked them to execute. There could be an informational issue where they have the capacity, but they don't have all the information. They don't have the understanding that's required to do it well or to do it fast. There are also issues of rhythm within a team in which each person really moves at a different speed. And so there's also just a process that has to go on over time in which we become comfortable with the rhythms of others, and we reach kind of an average rhythm as a team that is okay for the larger team, for the larger effort. So that's one half. The other half actually has to do with the person who's delegating. And so the question that's important to ask yourself, and it's not to say that this is true, but it's important to ask yourself this question is, what are my fears about delegating, about losing responsibility for a task, about something not being done on my schedule? Why is this such a problem? What am I afraid of giving up? What's the worst that could happen if I did? Because I think this is a very challenging issue for people that are very driven, very oriented towards results and high performance, and sometimes a sense of like, I have to do it myself in order to do it at the standards I want. And that's not a illegitimate way of thinking, because it is important to do things with excellence, and it is important to do things on time. But often when we say that we're afraid that things aren't going to happen on time, what we're actually speaking about is not the reality of how things are playing out, but it has to do with more our fears about losing control over something that's very important to us. And so that's where this personal side of leadership development is so key and so challenging. And so I think the question there is one that's key for reflection, and it goes back to this idea of that experiential learning is so powerful, but if we don't ask ourselves the right questions, if we don't take the time to examine what's really happening, we often can miss out on the opportunities to have that moment of growth.
Thank you. So another question is just about the experiential part of a lot of this learning. It seems like the hardest things, the things that are most difficult, are things that are more aptly learned through experiential learning. So how do you go about supporting that sort of learning in your workplace, on your team, or among yourself, for yourself?
Sure. So if we think back to the earlier parts of the presentation, just to remind everyone of a few key concepts. One is that there's a dynamic interplay between formal learning and informal learning. And for most of us, it isn't going to be a course or a training or a degree program, but it could be something like reading a book or finding an online resource, taking a short course, tuning into a webinar about a topic we want to learn more about. And to the degree to which we can connect those types of formal learning, even in small quantities, with the things that are going on in our life, the things we're trying to work on, there's an interplay there that is just fascinating and can really accelerate the growth, accelerate the learning process when there's this sense of you're experiencing new things, you're finding tools, resources, frameworks that help you to understand those new things and to do them better, to do them more effectively, to do them with more knowledge and more understanding. The other two strategies that are so key here and that are in our 5 strategies is this idea of creating space for reflection, we'll come back to this again and again, and building learning relationships. And so reflection is something that occurs in private moments, but also in the context of meetings, in the context of feedback sessions, in the context of dialogue with others. And these learning relationships, we need to have peers that we trust, who challenge us, who provide new ways of thinking, who we can bounce ideas off of. And we also need mentors. We need people who have a different set of experiences, who are at a different place in life, who have a different set of capacities maybe, who can bring new criteria, new ways of thinking to bear on the problems we're facing. And when we do that, again, our learning cycle becomes much shorter, much more powerful, much more effective.
Thank you. Just one last question before we start closing down. Kind of going back to an idea of different contexts, what are the main differences and challenges between leading or supporting leadership among people with very different educational backgrounds, from people with very low educational levels to more educated peers?
Yeah. It's very challenging to work with a group that is heterogeneous in its makeup, that is really diverse in terms of people coming in with very differing sets of previous experience, perhaps capacity, perhaps knowledge about a given subject, educational level. It's actually with a lot in our YouthActionNet programs, because our fellowship programs select young social entrepreneurs based on potential, based on innovative models, based on what they bring to the table, but not necessarily based on previous education level or the level of sophistication that they have in terms of their current connection to the social innovation and social entrepreneurship ecosystem and where they're working. And so we have some people that have had coming to our programs with maybe multiple master's degrees or something like that, and are sitting next to someone who this is perhaps one of their first experiences of really getting into this space of social innovation, social entrepreneurship, and they don't have a lot of formal education. And one of the things we try to do in those kind of environments is to create a space in which each of these individuals realizes that they have something that they can offer the other and something that they need to learn from the other, that there really is a space of equality, that we've had different sets of experiences coming in, but it's not to say that one person is at one level and the other's at a different level. There's a lot of interesting learning that can occur when you put people like that in the same room, and where you open a space in which they can speak to each other from what they bring to the table. So that's really important, and it's something I very much believe in, that we each have something to offer, and we each have something to gain in any learning relationship, and that this is essentially about equality. That being said, it is a slightly different context if you're a team, if you're leading a team of people that has very different capacity levels. That's something that has to work itself out at the level of processes and the level of actions. And it may be that you can find a system in which you can cultivate the potential of someone who's not had the same level of opportunities, and that they can really grow and take on new levels of responsibility, take on new roles, and become experts in their own right. There are other situations where that's simply not possible because you're on an incredibly tight deadline. You need a high-performing team, and you need people that are ready now, not ready in 6 months. And so I think you have to be honest as well at the moment in which you're hiring people, at the moment in which you're forming a team, about what you really need, because it comes back to this idea of challenge. And if you give people too much challenge, a challenge that they're not ready for, they can easily shut down. And it's not fair. It's not fair to them, and it's not fair to the larger team. And so it's ideal to not bring someone onto a team who's not ready for the level of challenge. But if you realize that someone is on your team who's not able to pull their weight, who's not ready for what's being asked, that can actually be a moment in which you have to talk about their leaving the team and about finding someone else. And that can be a very hard discussion, but it can be a very necessary discussion.
Thank you, Joel. So we're just going to start closing up now. And as we're signing off, Joel, I just wanted to see if you can maybe say again the title of that study by Zenger and Folkman?
Sure. It's called The Extraordinary Leader. If you do a quick Google search, you look on Amazon, it's pretty easy to find. It's a very popular book, and it's a really unique study in terms of this type of information. And I see that we've posted into the chat window the link.
Right. So thank you very much for your time, Joel. If you need any more information about YouthActionNet, or if you have any other further questions for Joel, you could find us here. Our contact information is up on the screen. As you start signing out, please remember to do the survey. There's a quick survey. It's just 2 questions, and that'll help us as we program webinars for the future to try to provide relevant and interesting information and opportunities for everyone. So thank you very much for everyone for attending and taking time out of your day to be with us, and we hope that this was useful for you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.